Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. So welcome to the first of hopefully many such Hindu-Jewish interfaith dialogues. The inspiration for holding these dialogues really comes from the initiative made by my guru, Pujya Swami Dayananda Saraswati ji, who organized the first Hindu-Jewish Millennium Peace Summit under the aegis of the Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha and the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. So amongst the major world religions, Hindus and Jews share much in common, especially given our commitment for mutual respect and our non-proselytizing ways. So following the adage of live and let live, basically. Furthermore, both Jews and Hindus have both shared a long history of persecution and marginalization. And so this is also something we definitely have in common. So these dialogues are a continuation of the earlier efforts led by our teachers, and through them, we hope to forge a stronger friendship and relationship between our respective communities. So the first dialogue today will be questions posed to our Jewish friends on topics related to Judaism. And I would like to introduce our noted speakers. So the first speaker would be Nathan Katz ji. He is a distinguished professor emeritus in the School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. He was the founding chair of the Department of Religious Studies, the Bhagwan Mahavir Professor of Jain Studies, the Kaufman Professor of Global Entrepreneurship in the College of Business Administration, an affiliated faculty in the College of Medicine, Director of Jewish Studies, and the founder and Director Emeritus of the Innovative Program in the Study of Spirituality. He is also the co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Indo-Judaic Studies. Katz ji is also the author of 15 books and more than 100 scholarly and popular articles. Our second speaker would be David Markji. David is the CEO of Kahil Group, an online influence and intelligence agency based in Israel that focuses on shifting the global public opinion for organizations, governments, and businesses. David is also the founder of Israel Rising, an online magazine that stakes out an alternative approach to the geopolitical situation in Israel and the surrounding region. So the questions today will be structured into three themes. First, we'll be looking at the early history of Judaism. Next, we'll be looking at the scriptural teachings and the specifics of the metaphysics of Judaism. And lastly, we'll be looking at the recent history and the contemporary affairs. So I would like to begin posing my questions, but first I would request David ji to lead with an opening prayer.
We should, in Judaism, the concept of the Almighty is that there's really nothing but the Creator, and each one of us should be blessed to carry the Creator's light into the world as we enter into these unique dialogues, which I know we're all going to find very fascinating, and take both of our cultures, which are two of the most ancient cultures in the world. We should find a blessing from our discussions and find increased light in the world that will lead to peace for all mankind.
Amen.
So I would like to begin asking the first questions regarding the history of Judaism. We all know Judaism is the first amongst the Abrahamic religions. So could you please tell us more about Abraham and his descendants?
David, do you want to start it?
Actually, I feel that I'm probably the most from where I'm actually sitting right now. About a half a kilometer up from me is where Abraham stood and prayed to the Almighty, and he looked out across the same view I have right now as the one of the Dead Sea, and he stood there with his nephew Lot, and he divided the two areas. Not only that, it was also where Abraham stood, and he prayed on behalf of the people of stone. It says in the Bible that they were eventually destroyed, and God did not. He couldn't find a righteous person amongst them, and that was the deal he made with the Almighty. And the Bible goes on to say how they were destroyed from their wickedness. So I find it this is very apropos for me to kind of begin the historical what turned out to be Abraham and his descendants, and where we're sort of the Jewish people and other Abrahamic faiths. Abraham came to God later on in life, although it's said that he started when he was at a young age. He started asking about the idea of there being one God. He actually smashed his father's idols, and he eventually was sent on a mission out of what is today Iraq. Okay, so then it was known as Ur Kasdim, and he came to Israel. That's what is today Israel, and was known as the land of Canaan, because the Canaanim lived there, the Canaanites lived there, and he dwelled here. In the Bible, which is really all of our information about Abraham, it's clear that he's on a mission the entire time. His mission is to spread the message of there being one God in the world, which at that time people had clearly forgotten. It's actually very interesting. There's points in time where it's clear that he's, as much as Jews are not, Jews are not proselytizing religion, Abraham clearly was. He gathered people to him. He took people away from idolatry and brought them to this faith in the Almighty, in the one Creator, and they followed him around. And it's clear that it was not just him and his children. It was actually crowd of people that was following him. I had the merit about last year to go down to the ancient city of Beersheba. Beersheba is about 40 minutes south of where I'm sitting now. But the ancient city of Beersheba, actually, they uncovered the entire ancient city, and they found what was, they believe, the well of Abraham. Now in the Bible it says that Beersheba played this interesting role where Abraham used it to spread, called out to the nations of the world to worship the one God. So this is quintessentially Abraham's mission in the world. His mission is to spread the light of the Creator, and he passes this mission down to each one of his children, to Isaac, to Jacob, and we'll probably touch on this in the metaphysical section, but just a little bit is that each time it's passed down, there's this sort of opposing force. So he passes it down to Isaac, but there's also this opposing force, Ishmael in Hebrew, right? The what is today the Islamic world buys into that they are the descendants of Ishmael. And then Isaac passes it down to Jacob, and we have Esau, which is in Jewish mystical tradition becomes the Christian sort of world. So we have this sort of break off every single time he's passing it down till it gets to 12 tribes. That's the early stages in a nutshell. Nathan, want to carry on from here?
No, I think just by say a word that we Jews call him Avraham Avinu, which means Abraham our father, and we consider him our literal father from many generations of descent. So we have that kind of relationship with Abraham. He is the first Jew, we are told in our little children's textbooks about the Bible. And so he is for us. Now, Abraham also is significant in Christianity and in Islam. So Christianity largely takes the whole Jewish narrative, the whole story that's told in the Bible, and it moves past that and reinterprets it. So it goes on to include in the so-called New Testament the stories of their Messiah Jesus, but it also looks back and reinterprets all the Jewish figures in the Bible. So they look at Abraham differently than we do. To them, he was a spiritual father, certainly not a literal father, and he's important to the theologians of Christianity, but he's never been a popular object of devotion or of religious behaviors. Islam comes along later, and they pick and choose parts of the Jewish story in the Torah and parts of the Christian story in the Gospels, and then they weave that together with the story of the revelation of the Quran through the prophet Muhammad. For them, Abraham was not the first prophet, but the one who started this particular cycle of prophecy. The first prophet goes back to the first human, they say, but effectively, Abraham's the ones who brings in this cycle of prophecy to the world. So Abraham is a great prophet, the first prophet of this cycle for Muslims. So all three have some sense of descent, either spiritual or cycles of prophecy or literal, to Abraham. They all consider him a father in some sense. So scholars began to call these three religions taken together Abrahamic religions, because Abraham is sort of the forebearer of each of those religions.
So I have a follow-up question over here. So Abraham had three children, right? So they were Yaakov, Ishaq, and Ishmael. So the descendants of Yaakov are whom we consider the Jews. Is that correct?
Yitzchak and Ishmael, Isaac and Ishmael.
Isaac and Ishmael, okay.
Jacob's the next generation.
I see. So my next question is regarding the narrative of Joseph being sent into slavery and the story of Moses, if you could give us some more insight into that.
It's a very, very long story. But the great-grandson of Abraham was a favored son, and as a favored son, his brothers didn't like him very much, to the point that they, according to the story, sold him as a slave to some Egyptian merchants, and they took him to Egypt. David was a kind of seer. He could interpret dreams. He was very intelligent, wonderful poet, and also, they say, extraordinarily handsome, just for good measure. And he, in the courts of Egypt, through a whole bunch of events, he ends up as the prime minister to the pharaoh, to the king. So then he invites Jewish people to come and live there, and many do go there, and everything's fine. But as the Bible sort of frighteningly says, but then after generations there arose a pharaoh who knew not Joseph. He didn't remember Joseph, so to speak. So by then, and he said, these Jews are getting to be numerous, they're clever, we got to control them. So they put all kinds of oppression on the Jews and reduce them to a condition of slavery. Stays that way for a couple hundred years, and then finally, well, that's a long story. An adopted son of the Pharaoh, who happens to be Jewish, is Moses. So he's going to be the next Pharaoh. He's, sort of like Joseph was before him, except he has no notion he's Jewish. But through a series of events, he finds out he's Jewish, and he kills one of the slave drivers, and he runs back to the mountains outside of Egypt, where God talks to him and sends him on his mission to speak for God to liberate the Jewish people from slavery, which, of course, he does in very dramatic and glorious fashion.
So this would be the narrative of the burning bush?
Yes, very, very good. And then Moses goes on as the leader of the people. Eventually, they receive the sacred book, the Torah, and eventually get up to and finally take residence in the land of Israel. So, a lot of stuff.
I see. And where does the Ten Commandments figure?
David, I'm talking too much. You go ahead.
So the Ten Commandments occurs roughly 50 days after they leave Egypt. We actually still do this every year. We count down from Passover to what's called Shavuot. It's seven weeks of 7 days, 49 days, and on the 50th day is this reoccurrence of the Mount Sinai, which is the Ten Commandments. Okay, and just to go slightly deeper, what makes us different than any of the other, let's say, three Abrahamic faiths, or two other Abrahamic faiths, is that we actually, as a nation, heard the Ten Commandments. And this is oftentimes used as a logical or a rational proof against many of the, against Christianity, against Islam, as being religions built around one individual. The Mount Sinai episode, the Ten Commandments episode, is a foundational aspect of the Jewish nation because of that, because it was a national experience. And it's virtually, I think, on a logical basis, impossible to disprove a national experience of such magnitude. And that becomes as I said, a foundational part of our belief set. In fact, there's two givings of the Ten Commandments, right? There's Moses goes up to the Mount Sinai, and he's there for 40 days and 40 nights without food and water. And on his way down, he hears this sort of noise in the camp, and they're basically the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, are to start worshiping this golden calf. And there's reasons for it, and it's not the simple interpretation is obviously much different and much deeper. And so he ends up breaking the 10 Commandments. He ends up breaking them, and he has to go back up again and get another set of 10 Commandments. And that actually falls out in the date of Yom Kippur, which is which is coming up. That's the day where we all fast and for a whole day. So that's 10 Commandments. But like I said, it's a foundational aspect of our faith and our national ethos.
So the Jewish tradition existed before the 10 Commandments were given to Moses. So what were the value systems that were followed prior to the giving of the 10 Commandments?
So the Ramban, who is a Nachmanides, who is a medieval interpreter or commentator on the Torah, actually says something quite, I think, believes he gets it from an earlier source, and he says that the Jewish people before the 10 Commandments, and he specifically points to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they kept the Torah, they kept the commandments in their kidneys, in their kitchkas, in their down in their lower. I mean, it was natural for them. It's hard to explain, but it became it was like naturally part of their life. It was I usually call it the primordial Torah. It was a tribal Torah, which they kept in a very natural way, but it was not organized, and therefore.
So in a sense, it was part of the innate value system, and it was only later on that it needed to be hard-coded for people to follow.
Exactly what it is. It was a natural part of their value system, exactly what it would be. And then God came and they basically created a system, a hard-coded system.
Mm-hmm. I see. So next I would like to ask you a question about King David and Solomon, and also the significance of the first Holy Temple, if you could tell us more about that.
David, I'd like you to do this one too.
Again, from my view, I get to see where David ran away from King Saul. So it's quite interesting. It's one side point in the story where he runs away from King Saul. He ends up running down to the Dead Sea. And I always it's the lowest point of the story with David. So he's actually at the lowest point in the world, which is the Dead Sea, and yet he's at the lowest point of his time. Is not even a king yet. He's about to get killed. So it's a fascinating. You could see it take place. The descent drops so much you can see the whole story take place in front of us. That being said, King David was a unique figure. The Kabbalists, we're going to go into mystical thought later, but the Kabbalists call him the fourth wheel of the chariot because he actually makes up. There's three fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we wait a long time to get to this sort of follow-up fourth person, and which is David. And David is sort of this. He includes all the leadership personalities we see all the way through the Bible. It's fascinating. He's kind of like Joseph, who's like cast away by his brothers. His brothers thought David was an illegitimate child. He was the last of all the brothers. No one thought he would be king. He was a dumb, they saw him as a silly shepherd boy. And sure enough, he gets anointed by the prophet Samuel not because the prophet Samuel chose him, because God told the prophet Samuel, hey, this is the guy. And Samuel said, that can't be. He's a little nothing. He's a little frail. David was a frail little shepherd boy. And he ends up rising up. And the interesting thing about the story is he never thought he was king. He was constantly running away from the king, King Saul, and he kept on calling King Saul the king, but King Saul knew that David was the real king. So the whole time he would never challenge Saul. That was the amazing part of David's personality. He never challenged anything. He always ran away. He was a humble person. And sure enough, the kingdom of Saul falls apart. David actually comes to where I live, which is right near the biblical city of Hebron, and he establishes his first kingdom there for 7 years. Why in Hebron? Essentially, that was the capital of Judea, the Judah tribe, that was where David came from, and they had the northern tribes, which was still being led by the offspring of Saul. which was the tribe of Benjamin. And they go through this civil war for 7 years. It's actually quite fast, in 1 or 2 chapters in the Bible. And David, through a lot of political maneuvering, and he had a lot of charisma, pulls everybody to his side. And he eventually unites everybody behind him, and he fights a lot of wars. And because he fights a lot of wars, and because he makes, I'm not going to get into a few personal errors, God decides, and he tells him through the prophet Nathan, you are not going to build. You're not going to build the temple. Your son's going to build the temple. So what he does is he plans the temple. He plans the whole. He is obsessed by it. He plans the temple up until the day of his death. And the most interesting thing happens. King Solomon does not follow his plan. He does his own plan, which is quite interesting. His father spends his entire life planning for this temple, and he doesn't follow his plan, which is remarkable. And King Solomon is the wisest man that ever lived, and that's probably what's going on. I don't want to get into the story. A lot of stories with King Solomon. It's a lot of material, but the significance of the temple essentially was this: that for centuries we have what's called the tabernacle. And if you look at it very carefully, you see the tabernacle, which is basically carrying this presence of God, whatever that means, that's a deeper discussion, through the wilderness into Israel. It never has this sort of final place to rest until it gets to the temple. But as it's going through Israel, it gets more and more substantial, meaning it starts off as a tent, and as it goes through, it becomes more and more permanent, and then it finally gets to Jerusalem, and it becomes literally a building at that point. So it moves from a tent to a building, signifying a permanent hold over this mountain we now call the Temple Mount. The temple in Kabbalistic thought is the chamber which connects all the mystical worlds together, and it's more than just a building. It's the place where the world was started. The point of creation began. It's the point where the first offering was given by Adam. It was the point where the binding of Isaac took place, so on and so forth. Some people say it's also the place where Isaac prayed and Rebekah saw him for the first time. All these things take place at this point of meeting, which is God's presence, which is not a worldly presence, and our presence here, and that's the point of meeting. So that's the idea. That's the significance in a nutshell.
It's also interesting to point out that both the namesakes of King David and Prophet Nathan are present in this conversation.
Very good.
So my next question is, you mentioned Solomon's kingdom was divided into Judea in the south and Israel in the north. So if Jews take the name after Judea, then who are the present-day Israelites?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to start this one anyway. So the temple was built in the 10th century BCE, and David and then Solomon into the 9th century 9th century BCE, and they set up the kingdom, and it was united. But then after the death of Solomon, there were some better kings and some lesser kings, but it ended up there was a secession. That one group in the north had one king and one capital, and one group in the south had another king and another capital. The southern group's capital was Jerusalem, and their land was called Judea. And as you perfectly say, that is from the word from which we Jews get our name. It's Yehuda, Yehudi, all the Yahud, all these words that come from that same core. In the north, the kingdom was called Israel, and it was never as unified as in the south. And for whatever reasons, a neighbor to the northeast, what's now Syria, but then it was a different group of people called Assyrians, came, and I guess it's the 722 BCE, something like that. They conquered the north, and they took the people and drove them away. Okay. Now, the people of Judah were of the tribe of Judah, obviously that was their land, and the priestly tribe known as the Levites. Right? Levites didn't have their own land, all the others had land, but anyway, the people from Judah were Judeans or Jews, and the other group were Levites and the Kohanim and the priests. That's 2 tribes, but there were 12 tribes, So the northern kingdom of Israel was a confederation of 10 tribes, from which we get the whole story of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And if I may digress a little bit, because this is one of the most remarkable movements, mass movements in the world today, in my opinion, where you have people literally in every corner of the world, several places in India. My wife and I recently visited such a group in Mizoram. There's another group in Andhra Pradesh, and mostly some remote places in India, as well as in Papua New Guinea, in Japan, in Korea, in South America, in the Amazon, all over Africa. Amazing groups spring up and say, hey, we're the 10 lost tribes. We're this tribe or that tribe. So the first one who did this in modern, when we were writing in English anyway, were a group that are around Mumbai called the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. And it seems they may well have been correct. They've been mainstream. They're part of the Jewish world entirely. About 50 to 60 years ago, another group on both sides of the border between India and Burma, they started to come to this idea that they were Jews. And gradually they attracted attention from rabbis in other parts of the world. They came, they trained them, and they converted them, and they're Jews now, and many have been arriving in Israel rather recently. The third group in Andhra Pradesh, somewhere near Vijayawada, there's a group they call themselves Bnei Ephraim, the children of Ephraim, who have another story of their origins as one of the descendants of these tribes. So what this all means, mystics ponder, historians look at, and people who study economics and migration and things like this, they all have explanations and things to say about this movement. But I just stand in awe of it that now, nobody wanted to be Jewish before. Now it seems there are groups literally spanning the globe. There are many more such people in the world from these groups than there are people we recognize as Jews today. So it's going on in India. It's going on around the world. It's a great mystery.
I see.
If I can add a little bit into this. The two things: the tribe of Judah basically what is sucked in Simon and Benjamin as well. We see this in the Purim story, and we see that the hero of the Purim story is Mordechai, but it points out that he's a Jew, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which is very fascinating, because that's really the first time you start seeing other tribes being known as Jews. There's reasons for it, because what ends up happening is the king that's left over after the division is really the king of Judah after this 10 tribes get taken out, and there's a few verses in the Bible, and we can try to figure out these things mean that it seems that 2/3 of the tribes that were kicked out went south into Judah itself, and they were absorbed into Judah, which means you have 10 tribes not only going east, which pretty much that's where they went, but now south into Judah. And they all became known as Jews. So they lost their tribal affinity, they lost their kingdom, but they got absorbed into the greater. It says that, I believe that Jerusalem, King Hezekiah doubled the size of Jerusalem for them.
That's right.
We have this lost tribe phenomenon, but people are kind of skipping over this huge story that most of the tribes, they just became Jews already in the tribe in Judah. And where do we see that? Once again, we see this in the Purim story. A little hint of it. Why are you a Jew? Because the king is from Judah. Oh, my tribal affinity? I'm still this such and such. By the time the Jews came back from Babylon and Persia, they're all Jews. And that's the mystery of the lost tribes. I'm definitely a lost tribes person, but a lot of it can be solved by that little sort of those few verses. That being said, we have what they call Bnei Menashe in Kiryat Arba, which is near where I live. They came from East India. They firmly believe they're from Menashe. I have no doubt about it. It seems very, very clear to me, despite what a lot of people want to point to Africa and South America and I think Nathan and I would probably both agree on this point 100%, that it seems very, very clear that whoever was left over from the lost tribes clearly went east.
Mm-hmm.
That's naturally went. They went to Afghanistan. Some say they're the Pashtun. It seems very, very obvious that a lot of them are the Pashtun, and they went further into India till they reached Burma, possibly even Japan. I deal a lot with African tribes that either decided they are Jewish or feel they're Jewish. There's some sort of proof. I would say very significantly it's to the east, to our brothers in Afghanistan, India, and eastward.
So you raise an important point that the identity of a Jew is more having to do with ancestry than the affiliation of a given philosophy, right? So here it's more like ancestral based.
Well, yes and no, sorry. Most questions you ask a Jew, it's yes and no. The definition of a Jew is anyone born of a Jewish mother, A, or who converts to Judaism with the proper rituals, B. So there's always been streams of people converting into Judaism, and they are welcomed, and we are told you shouldn't even remind a convert that they're a convert. They're so completely Jewish as anyone who is born Jewish. So there is this kind of bloodline, but there's also a line of to convert, one has to have a certain body of knowledge.
I see. That makes sense. So my next question would be about the Babylonian exile, if you could tell us more.
David, I want to get the last one, but you take this one. You're muted.
The Babylonian exile. So this gets into some interesting stuff going on. It's really a transitionary period for the Jewish people. They went from this kingdom, a pretty substantial kingdom in those days. I'm not talking about in terms of size, but in terms of the world, the world around them did not believe it would be possible to destroy them. And here you go, all of a sudden they're taken out. And what's very interesting is Nebuchadnezzar didn't just take them out. Nebuchadnezzar was not a Shem. It's called a child of Shem. There's three sons of Noah. What you see in the area are all cousins. The Jews, the Arameans, the Egyptians. The Egyptians aren't, but the area right before them are. And you see all these different wars going on constantly for 500 years. They're all basically brotherly wars. We're all the Moabites, and all of a sudden comes this guy Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes right through, and he takes the kingdom that's impossible to destroy out. And the difference between Nebuchadnezzar and the other kingdoms around that time is the other kingdoms, Jerusalem, and if you'd conquered someone, you didn't destroy them. They were your cousins, right? So you just made them pay tribute. Nebuchadnezzar didn't care about that. He was known as a destructor, and so he pulled the Jews out. Now, there's two things going on here. He pulls all the leadership out first, the kings, the princes, and he leaves the rest of them there. It's usually written as, oh, they were all pulled out. No. They were left in Israel. Where was the mistake? He was giving them a little bit of autonomy. And make a long story short, they were fighting amongst themselves, and he finally finished it off. He came back and took the rest away, except many went down into Egypt. Okay? And the Bible says that they were lost. So we can tackle that another time, but who they are and maybe who they are today. But the rest basically a majority of the nation gets taken to what is today present day Iraq. I believe it's, you can correct me, 40 miles away from Baghdad, something like that. And that's when Nebuchadnezzar brings them, and he settles them there, and they quickly become part of the empire and kingdom. And the Babylonian exile lasts not as long as 70 years, because Babylon falls pretty quickly after this, maybe 10, 15 years, 20 years, and then comes Persia. But so the Babylonian exile is basically called the Babylonian Persian exile. The Persians were nice, they're benevolent, they come in, and they basically allow us to come back. But most people don't come back. Very few people come back. Most people stay in Babylon, and they stay in Babylon throughout the Second Temple period. It's not that they all came back. Majority stayed in Babylon. There were prophecies that they pointed to say we can't go back until the Messiah comes. Even back then, this was going on. And there was a big schism between the two communities, so much so that people that stayed in Babylon were admonished by the leadership in Israel. But there was trade going back and forth. The laws that were passed were shared between the two sides. But the exile of Babylon continues until 1950s. Essentially, up and down, wax and wanes. But the Jews that were in present-day Iraq, Syria, Eastern Syria, Saudi Arabia, all these areas are direct descendants of these Jews that had stayed behind Babylon. One little point is in the book of Daniel. You'll notice it's the first. If you look carefully, it's the first time it mentions anything about kosher food. It's the first time that the entire Bible mentions nothing about kosher food. Nothing. The Torah separated the 5 books of Moses. When they get into Israel, through the entire time, nothing but kosher food. All of a sudden, they're in a foreign land with non-Jews, and kosher food pops up. Don't eat. Be careful what to eat. You know, all of a sudden, you start seeing prayers take place. No mention of prayers during the time of. I'm talking about organized prayer. So Babylon begins this sort of transition. Whether we stay in Babylon or not is a separate issue. They carry that back to Israel, but this organized a different interaction with the Almighty in a national sense.
So you mentioned sorry, go ahead.
Very, very briefly, David has a very good point that it was in exile in Babylonia, that Jews developed these dietary laws, and dietary laws were written in such a way as to prevent social exchanges with Gentiles. When you're a minority group, when you're a majority, you don't have to worry about mixing and so forth. But when you're living as a minority under another people, those barriers become very important. And in traditional India, Lord knows, there certainly are many kind of dietary barriers between and amongst different groups that helps to maintain the identity and the customs and so forth of these small groups. Just wanted to throw that one in.
You mentioned a point about the Persians being rather kind towards the Jews, and were they also the ones who commissioned the building of the Second Temple?
Yes, correct. So there was a war, not long ago in the modern world. We had an Iran-Iraq war. Well, they had one of those back then in around the 6th century or so BCE, and Iran won that war. And King Koresh, or King Cyrus the Great, told the Jews who were living in Babylon, and living very nicely in Babylon in many ways, you can go back to your land and I'll help you rebuild your temple. But as David said, most chose not to go. Babylonia is also theologically interesting, and you all know the reggae song By the Waters of Babylon, where we sat down, how we wept when we remembered Zion, Israel. A wicked king, Nebuchadnezzar, came, carried us away into captivity. And then the big line, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? That's so full of meaning. Worship was done at the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That's been destroyed. This nationalist sense is very much, in my opinion, part of Judaism. They were in their land, their promised land, where they should be. That's gone for the ones who are in exile anyway. So there they are, and the king, and amuse us. Let me hear those great songs you used to sing in the temple. And how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Is to say, we are dislocated from our spiritual source as well as from our land. And how can we continue a relationship with God under these circumstances? And here, as David suggests, you had a tremendous turn in theological thinking among the Jews that to try to answer that question. That's a earth-shattering question. How do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And much of the major trends in Jewish philosophy and theology we have today came out, especially of the prophets who were among the leaders of the people in Babylon who tried to answer that question.
So you raise a very important point of discussion. What exactly is the promised land of Israel?
The exact boundaries are given slightly differently in different places, the Torah, but it's more or less, usually a little bit more, than the state of Israel today.
Sorry, I meant like conceptually, like what does it mean to be a promised land? Was there a covenant between?
Yeah, that goes back to Abraham, and God makes covenants with people to whom he enters a relationship. He made one with Noah. That's for all of Noah's children, which means every one of us in the world. He made one with Abraham that gets a little more specific. You follow me where I will show you, very open-ended, and I will make thee a great nation, and I will give thee a good land. So this Abraham's grandson, Jacob, became known as Israel. So we had the people of Israel. Now we have in the Bible, very early in the Bible, the idea of a land of Israel, a holy land, a promised land. And then there's also, in much more modern times, of course, the idea of a state of Israel. People, land, state, not exactly the same thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Sorry for the brief digression on that. So coming back to the temple, was the second temple built on the same site as the first?
Yes, same site. I'll be quick, Davey. I know you got a lot on this. Same site. It was never quite as good, though. And you read the text and the nostalgia. The first one, somehow, that's where we would really pray to God. But the second was there. It stood. It was the most magnificent building in the world of its day, according to our texts, and so forth. Later comes the Romans, and the Jews were often insurrectionists trying to get the foreigners who were ruling their country out. And finally the Romans got sick of it and just destroyed it. Destroyed the temple. You rip out the heart of a people, that's how you beat them. So he rips out the temple, he flattens Jerusalem, and many of the Jews, though not all, leave. And the sack of Jerusalem by the Romans led to the subjugation of the land, to its incorporation as a province called Philistina or Palestine by the Romans. It was the name of a Roman province. The name was chosen to be insulting to the Jews because these people were sort of been a pain in their side for centuries by that time. So that's the name. But there was no birth of a nation of Palestine or anything like that. It was an administrative entity of the Romans.
I see. Thank you for that. So this concludes our first section, and now we move on to the second one, which is the sacred texts. So my first question about that is, what exactly are the sacred texts of the Jews?
David, you can have your name on it, my friend.
We have the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses that was given to us at Mount Sinai. It's Torah as the law, but each book of the 5 books of Moses has a different quality to it. We have the book of Genesis, which is really, a lot of people say the book of faith, which is really the building blocks of this national entity called the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the selling of Joseph, and it ends with Joseph being in Egypt, actually dying in Egypt and making a promise that he'll be taken out. Exodus is the next book, and that's basically the story of the Jews leaving Egypt, Moses, and we have the 10 Commandments given in that book. And then we move on to Leviticus, which is the laws of the Levites and the priests. There are some few side stories and some other laws that are given to the nation, but pretty much the laws for the priests and the Levites. And then we have the Numbers, which in Hebrew it's Bab Midbar, which is always interesting to me because Bab Midbar is in the desert, but it's always translated as Numbers, and essentially you see a lot of number taking there, where you're constantly counting the nation as it's traveling through the desert. A lot of stories going on there, also national stories, conquering of various areas. Even in Moses' time, today with the Golan Heights. That was actually conquered in the book of Numbers, and then we have Devarim, which is the last book of the 5 books, and that's basically Moses recounting everything. I believe the whole book takes place in 3 weeks, because Moses is sitting there telling the nation, because he's speaking to the children of the people who came out of Egypt, because he spent 40 years in the desert, so he's preparing them to go into Israel. After this, we have with the rest of the Bible, which is more or less in chronological order. It follows the conquering the land, and all the books of the Bible what the Christians call the Old Testament, and then we have a lot of the prophets, which are not in chronological order necessarily, but they are literally, catalogs or chronicles of the prophets' teachings, some history in there, some correlation, and then you have what we call scrolls. Okay, so we have 5 scrolls. We have the scroll of the Persian story, the scroll of what we call Eicha Lamentations, being what Jeremiah wrote when we were kicked out of Israel, the scroll of Solomon. We have and we have a few other scrolls. We have also Psalms by David. We have a very other type of what's called the Jewish canon. In a nutshell, this is redacted pretty much by Ezra, the scribe, coming out of Babylon, which is another reason why Babylon becomes this sort of transition zone, because what we see in the books before this is we're living those books. What happens in Babylon is we take all those books, we redact them, and they become kind of fixed outside of our experience as a nation. So our nation learns from the things they did in their past from those books, but no longer as experiences them as a national expression. And what begins to happen now, I mean, at the time of Babylon and Persia, into the Greek period, is the beginning of what we call the oral law. Now, there was an oral law before this, but it was really not concretized or redacted or before this, before the time of Babylon. The exile there, Persia, Greece, and Rome, forced the elders to begin to get together and share ideas on the different commandments and their expression in the Jewish world. What ended up happening after the beginning of the Roman exile is we redacted what's called the Mishnah, which is the first of the kind of written down oral law. And that leads to what they call the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. And then ultimately the famous one, which is the Babylonian Talmud. We have a series of mystical books, the Zohar, the Bahir, we have the Sefer Yetzirah. These are all mystical books. That the modern mystical thought kind of springs out of these, and this goes all the way to the Arizal and so on and so forth. And obviously the books of the early Hasidim, the Baal Shem Tov, and so on and so forth, Chabad and Breslov, all the way up to the modern time.
So the 5 books that you refer to, which form the Jewish Bible, that is what the Christians refer to as the Old Testament, right?
The Christians refer to as the Old Testament, or those 5 books plus most of the prophet book, the books by the prophets. And they have a couple out and a couple in, but that's Christian Old Testament's all that put together.
Okay. And all of these are what you call the Torah?
The Torah is the 5 books, and the rest of it is Joshua, Kings, Judges. That I wouldn't call that Torah. That would call more of our historical prophetic liturgy,
and what is the Tanakh?
That's exactly what that is. That's Tanakh. That's Tanakh is Torah. Nach is the letter N, or in Hebrew it's the Nun, is Nevi'im or prophets. And then we have the cover is a C, it's writings. Okay, so all together that's what you call the Tanakh. That's exactly what the Christians call the Old Testament.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, yes. And you also mentioned the scrolls. So are the Dead Sea Scrolls a part of them?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe Nathan could take this part.
There is overlap. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, I think, 1948 outside of Jerusalem, where you can see from where you're sitting down towards the Dead Sea, obviously. And they were kept in these clay urns, and it was so dry there they didn't. They were preserved for 2,000 years till they were found, and they were from sort of a. No, there's not 100% agreement, but probably some eccentric mystical sect that lived in the caves and saw the whole world as corrupt and tried to live a super pure life apart from what goes on in Jerusalem. So those are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are unique. They've never been anywhere else. But a couple of the Dead Sea Scrolls have been biblical, the same thing or very close to what we have in our Torah, parts of it. So it's a little of this and a little of that.
I see. My next question is about the 13 principles of the Judaic beliefs, if you could tell us more.
Go ahead, David.
They're written down by the Rambam. Interestingly enough, it's not so clear how structured or redacted they were, but they become redacted over a period of time. It's pretty, if you look enough, they're pretty clear. These are the 13 principles. There are definitely, in the time of the Rambam, it was 1,000 years ago, there was definitely some give or take on this, but most people agree that this, he's unmatched in terms of his superior wisdom, and he really, he got to the essence of it. The 13 principles really are broken down into, I would say, 3 different sections. One, the faith part. They're all faith, but I would say the structural, foundational faith. And then we have the concept of Torah, prophet, and then we have the future. The future is going to bring, and that's the structural. Without getting to every single one, we don't have enough time. But that's actually the structure that goes on. Just to, the first one, just to, obviously you have to believe in God, as that's the only being, the only real truth is the Creator. And that's just one example of the first third. The middle third, as I said, is the mixture of the veracity of the Torah, the entire Torah, every letter, every word coming from heaven. Also, Moses is being infallible completely as a prophet. That's the middle part of the middle section. And the last section is the resurrection of the dead and the coming of the Messiah. And also in the middle section, very, very importantly, is that there's a right and wrong in the world, that if you God will punish those who don't follow the Torah. So that's all in the middle section. There's, as I said, the third section.
Are these 13 principles part of the written Torah or the oral Torah?
They're found, verses are found in the written Torah to substantiate the Rambam's establishment of them, except for 2 things. The resurrection of the dead and the coming of the Messiah, which is not written about at all in the 5 books of Moses, in the Torah, and the 5 books of Moses. In the later writings, which is the prophets, and this obviously that's in there. But in the 5 books of Moses, very interesting enough, there's no verses that show those 2 things.
I see. Earlier on, you had mentioned about Jewish mysticism. So this refers to the Kabbalah, right? Could you please tell us more on that?
Okay, so the Kabbalistic thought is one which is in Kabbalah itself. The evolution of it is actually built into the thought process, which means it's supposed to evolve. It's supposed to be expressed over a period of time, which is meaning, like, even speaking about it, not just in non-Jews but amongst Jews, it was always forbidden because it was such a high level of ideas. According to this, I'm actually going to go backwards, right? In Hasidic thought, which is this sort of the fine point of the evolution of Kabbalah, those who are Hasidic, the Baal Shem Tov, the father of Hasidim, the Hasidic movement, actually taught that now is the time to bring this into mainstream thought. Chabad has even gone further and said even non-Jews also should can learn Kabbalah. Why am I starting at that point? Because we see the end point is this evolution where really the whole world gets to this mystical sort of idea of God and the mystical teachings. In a nutshell, Kabbalah is actually a lot less spiritual than it is mechanical, which really is a downer for most people, because most people assume that you're going to learn Kabbalah and be zapped out, or be connected to some deep spirituality. But it's really it's almost like physics. You've very simply 5 worlds. We are now what they call the world of Asiya, the world of doing in action. No one has a conscious recollection of the 4 worlds above us, by the way, as we're in this world. Even the most holiest person, it's not that they can live in those worlds or are conscious of it. They're unconscious levels. As the world becomes less physical and, so to speak, closer to God, obviously God is everywhere, but so to speak, closer to God, the conscious level changes. I'll just quickly say this is the world of Asiya, the world of doing. The world above this is the world of Yetzirah, formation. It's very interestingly enough, Yetzirah is, there are 2, the word for inclination, bad inclination, good inclination is Yetzer. It's Sirah, it's the same root. So most Kabbalists teach that in that world just above ours is where our emotional kind of formation takes place, good, bad. Above it is the world of Bria, creation, which is parallel to our mind. Bria is, as I said, creation. What we do is actually all creation begins here. When I want to create something, when I want to actually do something, express in reality, it starts in my mind, it goes to my heart, and then it comes out to my hands. Above that are two worlds. When I say world dimensions is a better example, better way to say it is we have Bria, we have Adam Kadmon, which is above, which is closest to the Creator, so to speak, and we have a world between them, and those two worlds are beyond any sort of explanation. We have a world which is called Atzilut, which is the world just above that world where we use a parallel to our brain. The word Atzilut, the root is Eitzel, which means next to, very close to the Creator. So close to the Creator that we have no conception of it. Okay. The final world is really matched up with the one step away from the Creator, or part of the Creator, so to speak, and that is, interestingly enough, very parallels a human being. Ultimately speaking, the Creator, Kabbalah is the word for receiving. Okay, so the idea is that really we're all hot-wired back up to the source. You know, there's a so to speak, electrical wire back up to the source of creation, and we're supposed to get ourselves through these teachings to a point where we can receive that light or that godly will. We're not supposed to kind of escape to those worlds. We're supposed to create a world down here for those that godly light. I'm going to just tie it back into your question about the temple. The purpose of the temple is a global point in time where the globe can receive that godly light from those worlds.
I see.
Okay.
And there's also an element of numerology involved in Kabbalah, if I'm correct?
That's correct. That's it's called gematria in Hebrew. It's very, very intrinsic and integral to the entire. I think every letter in the Hebrew alphabet is matched up to a number, and there's different forms and types of this numerology. And this, I'll give you one interesting one, and then we can move on. Just to think about it, is if you look at our hands, there's 14 parts to each hand, right? So if you count the first letters in the verse in Hebrew in all of the Torah, there's 28. So 14 and 14 are 28. What is that teaching us? That we're actually supposed to be actively part of the creation. Not only that, is the word for hand is yad, and that's the numerical value of 14, which is the parts in the hand. So the letters, actually, the words in the Torah match up, reflect oftentimes these numerical values and parallel expressions in creation.
You have it's this way of thinking about the words of the Torah is not altogether different from the way the words in the Vedas are thought to be by some, especially the Mamsaka school of thought, where the words are eternal and their letters are intrinsically connected to the nature of the thing they designate. So I won't say more than that, but there's a very strong parallel right there.
Yeah, the reason I asked about the numerology part is because I had my first exposure to Judaism in a very unorthodox way through Darren Aronofsky's movie Pi. So I know it's completely, obviously it's not representative, but I thought I'd just make that connection.
That's a good connection.
So my next question is really looking into the metaphysics, and each of these sub-questions within that question could probably have a session of itself. But if we could briefly answer these 5 questions, starting with, what is the Judaic understanding of God?
I'd like to start it because I've been thinking about that one. I think I can do it with some conciseness. Now, first of all, it is said that every letter in Torah has 70 different meanings. So when you put a sentence together of letters, every sentence in the Torah has so many meanings, so there is no one. There are agreed upon themes like the 13 principles of faith, but what is the nature of God? You will get very different answers from our teachers. So I go to the Rambam, who David has been mentioning, probably the greatest of all Jewish philosophers. And his formulation of the truest statement we can make about God is that God is simultaneously the knower, the known, and the knowledge. Now, that ought to sound extraordinarily similar to you than what Shankaracharya says. It is this absolutely incorporeal, totally beyond thought, and the only way, if we want to say anything, really, we have to say negative things, because whatever we think is not it. Neti neti, as your tradition says. So that's the first thing about God, is this utter transcendence to mind, to nature, to everything. But in order for there to be a world, and it's a long story why there should be one, but God has reasons that we may or may not understand. In order to be a world, this total effulgence of God has to create a space for the world to exist in. Let me kind of a little bit different way. They say for us, when we get to that place of God as his highest form, we are completely nullified. So we couldn't even know it. So to make a world, God reduces, makes space, steps back from the world, withdraws a little bit, and in that process, parts of his light tumble down to this earth and become encased in, the scriptural metaphor is walnut shells, like the meat of the walnut in the shell. The light is inside the shell. We also call this, that in certain Kabbalistic texts, God puts on garments to meet us. That is, an analogy is made, God's always the king. So a king can't appear in public naked, right? In order to reveal himself, paradoxically, he has to conceal himself in his clothes. So revealing and concealing are not simple binaries. So for God to create a world, for God to talk to us, for God to do anything, he has to step back and put clothes on, as it were, so that we can perceive God by very dimly, very remotely, and we're only seeing what he will let us see, and it's never the whole thing. But so everything David and I are saying about the religion, our Torah, our laws, our diet, our everything is considered to be a garment that God puts on so that he can reach us.
That's a very beautiful way to look at it, absolutely. Also, just out of consideration, is God the correct word that I use, or is a word that you would prefer?
It's as good a word as any.
Okay.
David's muted, I see.
No, definitely it works for me.
Okay,
it works. So my next question is again related to where you just left off about God creating the universe and stepping away. So what is the nature of the universe in theological terms or in philosophical terms? Would you refer to it as monism? Because you mentioned that God is everywhere, and yet that he is also distanced from the creation. So can you explain a bit more about that?
The distance is real. The garments are real. So it's words like monism or mono, they're very difficult, clumsy words to get subtle thinking. But I would shy away from that word, because on the basis that the garments are real and are our access to God, it's not that they disappear until there's that state of total nullification where we cease to be. But as long as we are in any sense in any of the worlds, we are talking through our clothes, through our forms.
Okay, I see. And what about the individual and his or her place in the scheme of things?
It's called tikkun. Means something that you and you alone can do with your life that is harmonized. That is what God wants you to do with your life, which is your that is your freedom, that is your highest calling, and the task is to figure out what it is. Now, let me say all this, David.
Yeah, I'll put in a little bit. Just to expand, really, is that in Hasidic thought, the idea of a tikkun, a rectification, like Nathan said, every person has a specific rectification that they have to undertake. We don't know what that is. It ultimately speaking, Hasidic thought, really Kabbalistic thought, mystical thought, teaches us that when a person is no longer here, they go up to the next world, so to speak, their rectification was complete. And we just, usually it takes a righteous person to actually be able to look at somebody's life and say, that was the rectification they needed. And we have a lot of Hasidic tales that talk about how a Rabbi, so to speak, would see, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this is why these rectifications took place and these people moved on. Very interestingly enough, that Rabbi Nachman teaches that you have to look at the world and say, the world was created for me. Everybody has to look at the world and say, the world was created for me. You have to look out at the world and see where it's lacking in your world, which is everybody has their world. It's not that there is a objective world. There is a personal world, and the personal world has to be rectified. Everybody has, like I said before, a rectification that's specific to them. And Rabbi Nachman says they have to look out and see where in their world there's things that are lacking so they can fix them. That's the Jewish view of the individual.
So here you speak about rectifying one's personal lives and whatever personal accomplishments there are to achieve. Is there a final ultimate destination? Like, for instance, Christians and the Muslims have the version of heaven. So is there also a version of heaven in Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, there is and there isn't. You have to remember, heaven and hell are Christian concepts, and the Muslims sort of appropriated them from them. We don't really have those same concepts. Okay, we have a place called Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which is in this world and in the next world. We have the Hebrew called Olam Haba, the world to come, and there's some disagreement on what that means. And then we have this weird, loose sense of hell, which is very, very vague, and it's not so clear. The mystical writings basically say, you're not ready to go to the next place yet. And everybody's great, but you're in this physical world, and you got to get cleaned up. Okay, so I'm going to toss you into this place that cleans you up for a little bit, and then you're fine. Once you get cleaned up, you're fine. In the world of Hasidut, Hasidic thought, and maybe even later Kabbalistic thought, we have this idea of, I don't want to get into the reincarnation thing. There's that's 4 hours unto itself, but Gilgul, it's called Gilgul, Migagel, to return again. It's not a returning the whole person comes back. It's a piece of the person comes back, so to speak, and they come back into the world. So in Hasidic thought, you start getting that, turning that into hell. Okay, not that you go to a fiery burning place, that the soul gets put back into this physical world where it really doesn't want to be, and it has to get back through it again, another rectification, until it finishes all its missions, and then it can go to the next world. The next world seems to be two possibilities: either where all the souls kind of hang out, and or the place where after the resurrection, everybody comes back. In one form or the other. It's not so clear which form it is, but they come back. Like I said, so we have a much less black and white version, or I hate to use the word primitive, but a very less primitive version of heaven and hell. It's more fluid.
And also, again, I guess I'm not using the right terminologies, but in your version of heaven and hell, you don't have to be, say, perchance a Jew in order to achieve the goal. You could just be a person from any faith living a good life and doing the right sort of things.
That's right. You have to look at the idea of covenant once again. And this is why it's very, very important. There's really no such thing as conversion in Judaism either. There is moving from one covenant to the other covenant. There's the covenant of Noah, and there's the covenant of Abraham. And each covenant's fine. There's missions in the world we're supposed to go on. There's rectifications we're supposed to have. And a Jew and a non-Jew can go to the next world. And by the way, it says in the Talmud, a non-Jew that keeps the seven laws of Noah and even learns Torah is as if he's as equal to the great priest of in Jerusalem. So we allow everybody to enter in.
No, I think that is a very important point to raise, especially in contrast to the exclusivist notions of a savior and so on. So I think
That's right.
most of us, Indians living in India or abroad, are steeped in the Christian version of Western history, and so that is the lens through which we even understand the rest of the Abrahamic faith. So this is very good insight for us, for sure. And I have so we move on to the final part of the interview, and that's regarding the recent history and contemporary affairs. So could you tell us about the history of the Jewish exodus under the Christian and Islamic rule, and where did the Jews emigrate to escape persecution?
Usually there was nowhere to go. In overwhelming number of cases, there was nowhere to go. And we saw that played out 70 years ago with the ship coming right here to Miami Beach full of Jews fleeing the Holocaust, and they were refused entry in this and every other country they tried. So that is in part why Israel is so important to Jews like myself who live in the United States, let alone people who live there. That is, if push comes to shove again, that's where I could live. So then we talk about, was it like under Christians, under Muslims? We have to break that down. Which century, which king, which country, and so on. There are good and bad times under each, but the worst were under Christian days, under the old Christian world of Europe, culminating in 1940s, and under Muslims, there. In Baghdad, Jews lived in Baghdad for 2,500 years, more or less securely, until very recently. In parts of Iran, for much of the time, another ancient community, Jews live well, but then it's so nice in Tehran, but in the shed they're being killed and persecuted in the same 1850s. So it's a very mixed bag, but nowhere except in post-Enlightenment days were Jews theoretically given equal rights with anybody else, and it was mostly only theoretically.
I see. Next we come to a rather painful topic, but what was the pretext that led to the Holocaust? Was it political, cultural, racial, or religious bigotry?
All of that, of course, all of that and more. It was evil. It was the presence of evil at an extraordinary level. So I would never reduce it to economic or social or other kinds of factors, though they do play into it. I mean, there's some things we can know. Germany lost World War I. They wanted to blame somebody. Europe, until fairly recently, intellectually and so forth, was thoroughly imbued with racism, thoroughly in their universities and so forth. It was not. It was considered polite in those days. So the Jews were a race, yeah, and they didn't like. Jews were the minority of all peoples in Europe. So if you have an other, that's the one it's going to be. There's also the long-standing religious, theological antipathy. You know, Jesus is a Jew, and you don't think he's the Messiah. If you're right, we're wrong. So we don't want you to be right, so we'll kill you. I mean, that's putting it a little oversimplistically, but there's this either one is true and the other isn't kind of mentality, which made us subject to religious discriminations. There was economic. All the other things played in. You know, like David was saying, you can't understand God at the highest. You can't understand evil at its deepest. And I just can't. David's is muted again.
I'll just chime in really briefly, because Nathan put it really better than I could put it, but I want to just give a historical kind of interesting parallel that's going on at the same time that the European Jews being decimated. You have the Zionist movement. It didn't start in 1948 or even the 1940s. It started really at the end of in the late 1800s And I'm assuming you're going to be asking a question in the Zionist movement, but I want it really should be separated from the Holocaust, because what's going on is you have this kind of movement towards a liberated Jew. And I don't mean a liberated in terms of an enlightened Jew, which is Napoleon's view, but a liberated Jew. By coming to Israel and creating a state, it destroys Christianity. If the Christian thought was the wandering Jew, the destroyed Jew, the hurt Jew, the pain Jew, Islamic theology, the same thing. Jews have to be second class. By actually forcing the issue by coming and actually not just settling here peacefully, but really creating an army and driving out the British Empire, which is what they did. They threw Christianity. Christianity's finished at that point theologically. And that hate and that anger, as they're doing this, drove it even further. The Europeans couldn't handle that, and that's why they gave money to the Arabs to destroy Israel. That's why they had I can't say that's the reason for the Holocaust, but it is an interesting observation that at the same time this is building here, they're going after the group of Jews left in Europe, because they can get to them. They can't get to They can't get to us here.
Yeah, the reason I was asking about, I was actually indicating Christianity's perception of Jews, because even as recent as Mel Gibson's film *The Passion of Christ*, which is very steeped into the pop cultural understanding of how Jews are looked upon as the one who betrayed Jesus, and I was just wondering if these sentiments they had been fermenting for a period of time, and for the longest time,
2,000 years.
And so I was wondering if it is these sentiments that culminated in the horrifying genocide of Jews that we refer to as the Holocaust.
Yeah, of course,
Definitely.
You preach hate for somebody, and then you kill that person. The hate precedes the killing.
Think about it in a deeper sense as well. Just expand who killed Jesus was the Romans, right? So like you kill him because he died, i.e. for their sins, and so like we have these Jews here, so we got to kill some more Jews. Like it becomes part of their sort of like desire to we want to get rid of this version of God we don't agree with, because they reflect that. That's in the Christian theology. The Jew reflects God, and they don't know what to do about that, because it's a problem for them. It bothers them, because if we're right, they're completely wrong. They've been doing something completely wrong for 2,000 years, and they have to get rid of that thing. So we see this played out now, by the way, with Israel. The vast majority of Europeans, for some strange reason, bizarrely enough, their society is collapsing. Really, still is out to try to destroy Israel from economic measures, supporting Arabs. They can't handle it. It's a very tough thing for them.
Even if you look in literature, if going back to Shakespeare and The Merchant of Venice, and you are shown Shylock is referred to as a Jew, and the Jews are always shown in very negative light as individuals who are greedy, and they're always after money. And this is something that I've never experienced in my relationships with so many of y'all, my Jewish friends and other friends that I have. So I was just wondering where these fallacious notions come from, and when they began to percolate in pop cultural idea of Jews.
Well, some of that was based in certain kind of realities. Jews were barred in, well, it depends which country and which century, but in much of Europe, Jews could not own land. Jews could not go to universities. Jews could not practice medicine or law or perform music. I'm thinking all the things Jews are good at. We were not allowed to do. So how could we make a living? And one way that was open was money lending. So they did. They had to live, but that became associated as a intrinsic Jewish characteristic. That's where it became a problem.
I see. My next question is regarding Zionism. So does it have scriptural sanction, or is it a recent political idea?
It's more complex than that, actually. It really was a grassroots movement. It was one of this sort of, and that's what kind of was interesting about it. It came from different quarters, right? It came from the religious, were Zionists. They began to come back in the time of the Vilna Gaon, and they're always Jews. But let's all just, there is one historical thing we need to set straight. There were always Jews here. Okay, there wasn't never a time there was not Jews in Israel, but we're talking about now the vast majority of Jews began to return to Israel, so to speak. In the 1800s, long before the secular Zionist movement underneath the Vilna Gaon, and we have the Hasidim, and we have all sorts of different groups coming in Jerusalem and Tiberias and Sfat. And then what happens as the mainstream secular Zionist thought put forth by Theodor Herzl takes hold. And there are other spin-offs of this, but he takes hold, and he looked at it as a sanctuary for the persecuted Jew. He really felt Israel, the land of Israel, was the place that the Jews should go back to from a secular sense. Later on, towards the end of his life, which was very short actually, he began to have tremors of maybe, not I wouldn't say religiousness, but a deeper perspective on the land of Israel. After Theodor Herzl, the Zionist movement broke down to various different groups. We had communist Zionists. We had what became the revisionist Zionist movement under these Jabotinsky, and ultimately speaking of these two major secular Zionist movements. We have for better or worse, the labor Zionist movement, which was Ben Gurion and all those people, and then we have Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin was the revisionist Zionists, and it's just two different ways of looking at the future state, where they wanted to go, and nobody, not one of those groups except for one small group, actually was vying for an independent state of Israel. They saw themselves as maybe in control of the colony of Palestine, eventually trying to get to an independent state through normal means. Nobody saw themselves as actually succeeding in pushing the British out until the British decided to ban Jewish immigration to Israel, and the Zionist movement began to flip over to an independent movement with a break-off group called the Lehi, the Stern Gain. Very small group, only about 1,000 members, but the British government said that they were the ones who actually were the reason for kicking the British out. They blew up train tracks, shot British officials, and they set the pace and the tone of what became known as the Great Revolt against the British Empire, which culminated in the British leaving on, in the Hebrew calendar, Hey Iyar, and the state of Israel being born. But nowhere along the line, up until maybe the late 1930s, mid-1940s, definitely, was there a movement for an independent state of Israel. Zionism always kind of was a loose, amorphous concept of people coming back to Israel underneath these different types of groups. No central authority to those groups other than this umbrella called the World Zionist Organization that had very little power on the ground. Very little power. They're usually higher up, hobnobbing with the Europeans, and the guys on the ground are kind of like taking land, and settling land, and it kind of really miraculously culminated in this sort of event called the State of Israel.
And so this is the contentious point on which Palestine is causing conflicts. Is that correct?
The conflict of Palestine goes back towards, really ultimately speaking, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. I mean, that'd just be, what they call Palestinian are loosely different tribal organizations that exist throughout clans that exist this area. The Jew was called a Palestinian up until the late 1940s, 1960s, even up until the United States of Israel, sorry. And by the 1960s, the Russian-backed Palestinian Authority or organization adopted that name as a PR tactic. But they were always sort of opposed to Jews moving here. They're usually inspired by higher ups, even British authority, to attack Jews. 1929, the pogroms in Hebron took place, wiping out the entire ancient Hebron community, which was there before the Arab clans that got there. That was British inspired, British allowed. You have different people picking on these sort of peasants. I would say that's what the Palestinians were, and they inspired them to do great damage. And now they're, this national movement really in a, how would you say, maybe Nathan can say it better than I can, an opposition national movement. It only exists because we have a state. Like if we weren't here, they would just be a bunch of tribes and clans. So they exist in opposition. They don't. There's no unifying force.
I see. And so are Jews still being persecuted or discriminated against anywhere outside of the Middle East at this point?
Europe. I'm sorry, I say that with surprise and so forth, but, you know, I'm afraid to go to Europe. And when I travel in America or in India, I wear this. I'd be taking my life in my hand if I did that in Paris or Amsterdam.
Which communities are there opposing this?
Which country?
No. Which communities in Europe? Is it the Christian community or the Islamic community?
It's a bizarre alliance of Islamists and far leftists, which have nothing in common except they hate us.
I see. So I come to my final question, which will nicely tie into our next session, which will be a dialogue with the Hindu teachers. What sort of relationships do Hindus and Jews currently share? Because you mentioned earlier that a lot of Jews had moved to India for political asylum over the centuries, over the millennia. And so, and since Nathanji has visited India several times and even given lectures on this very topic, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the relationship that we share.
The first thing I have to say is God bless Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs. Of all the countries in the world, no country has been kinder and more affectionate towards us. And this is one of the many reasons I have a lifelong admiration, a great admiration for India. Jews have lived in India at least 1,000 years, quite possibly 2,000 years. And as the leader of a gentleman who's no longer with us in this world, described to me when my wife and I were living in Cochin, the word anti-Semitism does not exist in our Indian dictionary. So, you know, the friendship that we're seeing in politics and trade and defense and tourism, that's wonderful, but it's based on something so much more bedrock in both of our historical experiences, even if we don't know so much about it, is something remarkable. Not long, you mentioned the Dead Sea, David, and a few years ago the governments of Nepal and Israel put out postage stamps of the highest point in the world, Mount Everest, of course, and the lowest point in the world, the Dead Sea. And they had it both for Nepali postage and for Israeli postage. And then last year, I think it was about 1 year ago, the governments of India and of Israel put out jointly issued postage stamps, one for Diwali and one for Hanukkah, festivals of light. That's a symbol. Those are symbols, but I think they're symbols that resonate very accurately and deeply with what both of our civilizations are about.
So that would be the end of my questions, and I thank you both so much, David Ji and Nathan Ji, for such an insightful dialogue. And I open up this forum. Perhaps we could have 5 minutes of just audience questions, and then we could call it a day. So thank you once again. And if anyone has any questions for the two of them, please ask them.
Somebody's raising their hand, but it is muted.
Yeah, Shamu bhai, go ahead.
Nope. It's still muted.
Yeah.
There you are. Kamath.
Okay. I want to ask about that. Recently, I read that some FBI report that the largest persecuted community in America is so. But Nathan Ji was saying that Jews are not that much persecuted in America compared to Europe. So.
The sound is coming across blurry somehow.
His question was that Jews, you mentioned that Jews were more persecuted in Europe compared to America. And Shamuk Bhai read a report which said that the most persecuted community in the US are Jews. So is there some validity to that?
Yes. Statistically, that's absolutely correct. Now, there are more, I mean, proportional to population, the violence against Jews is the worst.
I see. Any other questions? Just on the same note, I also wanted to, perhaps this is just a follow-up to Shamu's question itself. We see so many successful individuals who are Jews in the US who made a great name for themselves, especially in the film industry, whether you have Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg or just about anybody. So I admire the tenacity of Jews to survive against the odds and thrive in whatever situation that is put out in front of them. So I really admire that.
Thank you. You know, the Jews in Hollywood were good friends with the Jews in Bollywood. And in the 1920s and 30s, Jews from Mumbai and area would go to Hollywood to, learn new techniques of cameras or this and that, and come back and bring that into the Indian film industry. Quite a few producers, writers, stars, musicians, and all in Bollywood films were also Jews.
I did not know that.
Okay, it was also mentioned that in Europe there is a lot of hate by the far left. So far left is usually related to the non-religious groups, right?
The hate from the left is normally related to
religious groups, right? But still,
last few words to me, please.
He's asking that you mentioned being persecuted by the Islamists and the far left in Europe, and the question is, most of these far lefts are associated with non-religious groups.
Right. Exactly. I say these two groups have nothing in common except they hate us. I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious that it does not make sense.
What is the motivation of the far left to dislike Jews?
Well, it's interesting. I believe it's actually an outgrowth of Nazism. I think the far left in Europe is really it's its modern version of Nazism, because when you don't have, in the European psyche, if you don't have religion or some sort of spiritual underpinnings, you end up with Nazism. That was the ultimate sort of evolution of it, was like, there's no God, so we're just going to go around and do what we want to do. The left, really, the far left in Europe is not like the far left in America, and it's not like the far left here, and it's really its own organism, which is it's really decadent, and it gets so far left, it gets to the right. It's like it's so far left, it's fascist almost about it, and it's interesting because the Nazis and the Muslims in the time of World War II also hung out. So it's not surprising why that, it's not rational at all. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're talking about other than the fact maybe you have two very racist ideologies, so to speak. So racist sort of nationalistic ideologies in one of the far left and Islam. That's the only connection I can possibly see.
When you speak of the far left being a very decadent society in Europe, it has a lot in common with the far left in India as well. I must definitely mention.
Oh, yes, it does. Yes.
Wow.
I think on that note of commonality, we've almost hit 1 hour 45 minutes, and we can conclude today's session. So thank you once again, David G and Nathan G. This has been a tremendously insightful dialogue, and hopefully we'll have many more to come. So
thank you.
Would you like to close once again with a prayer?
I think it's very similar to prayer, but I think I think we've all gained a lot from this dialogue, and we should continue to grow in our ancient connections should come out more and more and more, and we should reach higher and higher towards to the light of the Creator and draw that light of the Creator into the world. As we say, chayil to chayil, from strength to strength, we should continue together.
Amen.